Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So today, the downside of having ADHD, these centers, I teach at um, Clouds and Water in St. Paul, and I teach here, and I teach at Cedar Rapids, although I've never been to Cedar Rapids because we live in the future, and I can be the resident teacher at Cedar Rapids without ever having been to Cedar Rapids. But both here in Cedar Rapids, they say, can you give us a description of your Dharma talk? And I've been so spoiled all my life because in San Francisco, it says Dharma talk, and you never have to say what you're going to talk about. Mm-hmm. And in Clouds on Water, you never have to say what you're going to talk about. So you all put me on the spot, and you're like, so what's your description of your Dharma talk going to be? I'm like, geez. And so I think I gave my title for this like less than a week ago. It wasn't that long ago. But one of the downsides of a brain like mine is that by the time tomorrow rolls around, it's like I don't even care about that anymore. But I do. I think this is a perennial issue in our tradition. And so, what is it? This dichotomy of easefulness and receptivity and effort. I think it's almost like there should be a middle way. We should work on that. But if we look at the early yogic traditions, going back to the Indian subcontinent and 2,500 years ago, the word for those traditions was shramana. So we call that early kind of proto-yoga the Shramana traditions. And there were Vedic Shramana traditions, and there were non-Vedic Shramana traditions. One of them is Buddhism, another one is like Jainism. Shramana, it's the same shram as an ashram. It means striving, or like a striver. And to this day, in the Buddhist monastic tradition, when you get ordained as a novice, you get ordained as a shramana or a shramanari. And so it's that word striver. And when I was young, I loved that idea. I wanted to be a striver. I was lazy, but I wanted to be a striver. Maybe that's why I wanted to be a striver, because I was lazy. I like that archetype of the person that's striving. And sometimes people in these like wisdom traditions, we call them seekers. I'm a seeker. But unfortunately, in my assessment, and I think the assessment of some of the ancestors of the tradition, is that you get what you practice. So if you practice seeking, you're habituating seeking. And if you're habituating seeking, you're habituating not having. You're habituating deficit. You're habituating the felt experience of deficit. If you habituate striving, then you're habituating non-ease. You're habituating a constant need for self-improvement. And so I think there are people in different lineages that have leaned into that, thinking like, no pain, no gain, and then there's people that have kind of backed off on that and be like, wait a minute here, that can be a disservice to yourself, because if we're trying to, I believe, one of the things that we're trying to do, one way to describe what we're trying to do, is to relax into the majesty of the felt experience of existing. Have you ever tried to relax? It's tricky because trying to relax is counterproductive, but also relaxation sometimes doesn't come easy. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the animal of how we are in our attempt to really enjoy our existence and all of the habituated energetic things that are running interference on that? I was, and I think part of the impetus of this thought was I was having Dokusan with a student a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about being really dissatisfied with their life situation. And there were like concrete things for them to be dissatisfied with. I wish we all didn't have to work. I wish the grocery stores weren't holding our food for ransom. But this is the circumstance that we find ourselves in. It's not our fault. Well, it's a little bit our fault, but it's our responsibility. And so the student was frustrated with his life situation, and he's like, yeah, I work X amount of hours, and it's really strenuous, and I don't have a lot of time. And I'm like, and he's like, but I know I should be able to, So I'm like, I don't know if you should be able to. I think that's a tall ask, and I think you're well within your rights to feel put out, And so it's like, so while you're trying to say yes to your life situation, part of saying yes to your life situation is, what can I do with this? What are the building blocks of moving in a direction that I'm interested in? Because it's up to you. And then he said, what did he say? And it struck me. He said, I know we're not supposed to have any goals. And I'm like, oh, we do say that, don't we? I'm so sorry. Because that's a meditation instruction. And so sometimes we hear these things that are meditation instructions, and then we're like, and that's how I'm going to live. And sometimes when you take something to its logical conclusion, you're taking it a bit too far. And sometimes when people are like hearing some of these teachings, in their early stages of hearing some of these teachings, and you say something like Zazen is good for nothing, or if you say something like, the notions that arise are mere appearances based on causes and conditions, it's like, you're trying to cheat me out of the meaning that I experience in my life. And I'm like, we're trying to develop an additional tool. We have all the tools, we have a lot of our tools, a lot of our ways to making sense of our world are well rehearsed. I was talking to someone yesterday, and I said, the really robust feeling of I in our subjective experience doesn't need any help. We don't really need to run around like reifying and holding and reasserting the sense of I. Sometimes it can be, I don't know, what's a circumstance where it would be useful to have a sense of I? There are some. When you're being, when you want to assert boundaries, when you feel like you're being taken advantage of, you feel like you're being disrespected, and you want to assert boundaries, then mustering the I can be helpful for that. To break the gravitational pull of being subjugated, Then mustering, but then using that I as a tool, but not a burdensome, constant self-experience, constant reference point. So this idea that I know we're not supposed to have any goals, it's kind of like, we say that, but that's for when we're doing the practice. And I think to rehearse the experience of not having any goals and getting a taste for what that actually feels like, And then at the same time, it's like, what's conducive to allowing myself to not have any goals? And then there are things that are more conducive to allowing ourselves to not have any goals for the period of time that we're meditating. And so that's interesting. Cultivating the ability, the circumstance to relinquish cultivating abilities and circumstances. So we're taking inventory of how this animal works, how this animal behaves. And all of us is a bit different. But there's a lot of congruencies and similarities. That's how, medicine and psychoanalysis and things like that are able to, someone can be, not every person needs their own licensed healthcare provider, because there are enough similarities that there's a lot of overlap, But we're all this kind of unique storm, unique cocktail, And so to enter our practice with the curiosity to try to see what we're like, for me, I got interested in Zen, and I knew that I was never gonna. There was this guy, what was his name, Zachary Smith, and he lived in Berkeley. And there's a Zen Center in Berkeley. I think there's more than one Zen Center in Berkeley. But for whatever reason, he liked San Francisco Zen Center. So he rode BART at like 4 a.m. whenever BART first started running. BART's the train system in the Bay Area. Bay Area Rapid Transit. When I first heard about it when I was little, I was really excited. I thought it was going to be yellow and have a little mohawk and a skateboard. Tell me we had shorts and stuff. He would come in on the weekday mornings from Berkeley and take BART early in the morning. And I think it was so early that it wasn't commuter hours yet, so he would be able to take his bike on BART. And then he'd ride his bike up the hill from wherever he got off in the station downtown to the Zen Center, which is up a little bit of a hill, 3 blocks maybe. And I was very kind of clear. I had no evidence in my life at that point as a 21-year-old that I'm capable of doing something I'm not forced to do, no matter how much I want it. I'm like, discipline has not been my strong suit, thus far in my life. So I'm like, so if I really want to do this stuff, I gotta go live there. So like pretty rapidly, it's like I got Zazen instruction, I like volunteered at the film festival, I went to like a one-day sit, and then I was living at Tassajara. That was me kind of responding to what I understood about myself. I'm like, okay, I need, if I don't go to the Zendo, I need someone to come knock on my door. I need that amount of support. I need that amount of scaffolding. If you don't have to do that, God bless you. Great, don't. Who was it? Fu Schrader. Someone asked her, why do people ordain as priests? And she's like, some of us need more help. And then after 10 years of living at the San Francisco Zen Center, I started to notice something else about myself. And it's like, I'm deferring the developing of the skills that it's going to take to be an independently existing person. And it's not just through my own wish for self-development, but I was actually tired of being told what to do by the elder generation. And I'm like, is this going to last the rest of my life? Turns out if I would have stayed, it would have lasted until about 2020. when they made that generation leave, basically. So responding to our circumstance, I don't know. I'm not telling you that just to talk about myself. I don't think. I hope not. To be like, what am I like, and what's beneficial for this one? Do I need to sign up for a class where I've invested money so that I'll feel an extra urge to go? Do I need to volunteer for like a Doan job so that I can get myself in a position to go? Does my body have like a energyless dormancy when I sit, and do I need to do an additional kind of energetic physical practice to make my meditation life more satisfying? And then we get into that thing. It's like, you want your meditation life to be more satisfying? And it's like, yes. Yeah, I do. And then it's like, well, that's against the rules. And it's like, fine. It's against the rules. But I need that a little bit, And so we're never doing something like 100%. There was a Tibetan teacher when he noticed when he was teaching shamatha, which is single-pointed concentration, he's like, everybody looked so stressed when I was teaching shamatha, because I would say, focus all of your attention. And for whatever, overachieving, Euro-Americans thought all of your attention means all of your attention. And he's like, oh gosh, 35% of your attention. You know, so to hold this spirit of just like relinquishing, what's the word? We have soda. Relinquishing, what's the word? Acquisitiveness in your practice. Try to relinquish acquisitiveness in your practice. But also, you know, check in with what your motivation is, and it's really up to you what you want Buddhism to be for yourself. I mean, there's a variety of kind of things that we offer, you know, like, you know, cool, interesting wisdom philosophy stuff, and like cool, interesting outfits, cool, interesting ease, you know. And so, like, okay, so what am I shopping for here, so to speak? You know, and a lot of times, sometimes, you know, hear the idea from the tradition that, like, well, you want to be doing Buddhism just for Buddhism's sake, you know, and that you're just involved because you're just somehow devoted and you're not trying to get anything out of it. I think that's suspicious. I think that's a little bit suspicious if someone says that is beginning and end their sole motivation. You know, when someone, I'm gonna have a drink here, I'm sorry. When someone asks me about priest ordination, and I'm like, well, what are you interested in priest ordination? And I'm like, I just want to serve everyone. I'm like, wall to wall, you just want to serve everyone? You know, there's not a part of you that just like, I would really feel enriched by officiating a ceremony. I just crave doing that. You know, the way like Taylor Swift wants to be on stage or something like that. And I'm like, that's legitimate. That's legitimate. I think it makes a good you got to have some of that interest so that you can perform the ceremonial and sartorial magic spell of space making in this tradition. Sartorial, if you don't know, I learned this I have this problem when I learn new words. I think everybody else has known them all along, and I was the last to find out. Sartorial means having to do with outfits. Sartorial magic spell means the vibe that you create through clothing, you know. And it's like, we can say that, well, no one's trying to create vibes through clothing. It's like, let's look at religion. People are trying to create vibes through clothing, and I think it's insightful. I think it's an insightful response to how we are. To notice that there's a tool there, to notice that there's sensory experiences people can have that can give rise to an encounter with the numinous, can give rise to awe, can give rise to curiosity. But I'm jumping around a little bit, I think. So on one hand, if we're, Dogen Zenji says, carrying the self forth is delusion. You know, if we think that there's a me that's going to like conquer something, you know, to arrive at a better version of me, you know, and when you look at the text, there's a lot in the text that corroborate that a little bit, you know, and I'm not sure if it's because, I don't know if the story of Buddha is the way that it is because that's exactly what happened, or if because that's how stories are told. You know? But we could look at that story and say, well, he was so motivated by his aspiration that he set out to achieve it at all costs or something like that. But if we could see someone doing what Buddha did now contemporarily, we might take issues with it. It's like, you just had a kid, homie. You know? So, to have a dose of orienting your aspiration to really something very local, very, very present in yourself, you know, very, very having to do with what your life is actually like. You know, we're not grafting ourselves into some kind of imagined realm of religiosity. You know, it needs to be rooted in, you know, my teacher used to say, the best practice is the one that you do. You know, so to figure out what we're gonna, what we can do with ourselves, you know, what's appropriate. So on one hand, the strife can be really, really burdensome. You know, but then, you know, like in my case, I'm like, well, I need a little bit of discipline, so I'm going to go to the place where meditation is compulsory. You know, or signing up for a retreat or something like that. I want to go see what it's like to really do this, and I need scaffolding. I need help because I'm not going to be able to just will myself through it. You know. And then the other sphere is like, well, it's all absolute reality, isn't it? You know, and there's nothing in particular that needs to be done. You know, and that's another thing that we hear in the teachings. You know, nothing particular needs to be done. But then if we hear that and do nothing in particular, we might be doing nothing in particular. Like, where's the practice there? You know, where's the recognition of how things are? Because if we're in a place where we don't recognize how things are, if we don't recognize the easeful aspect of our existence, and we don't do anything to recognize the easeful aspect of our existence, then we're going to practice not recognizing the easeful aspect of our existence, because you get what you practice. You know. So this is a little bit of a recap of yesterday, but one of our elders in the Suzuki Roshi tradition, Sojinma Weitzman, who led the second practice period I did, he used to say, awakening is an accident, and practice is becoming accident prone. You know, there's no guarantees that if you do X, Y, and Z, it's going to yield a specific result. You know, because you might be doing somebody else's X, Y, and Z. So where does that leave us? There's a koan that says, is it Teishan? But it's like, what is the teaching of a lifetime? And the answer is an appropriate response. So I think our practice is to develop the skills to have the capacity to respond appropriately with curiosity and affection for reality in each moment. An affection for reality. And start with this at the starting point of my body and mind as it is. What are the steps of moving towards curiosity and affection? And that's a personal answer, I think. Yeah. But there's little things we can do. Like when you're sitting, and I did this yesterday, forgive me. This is my new favorite thing. You take your arms and hold them away from your body with your palms facing backwards. And then you turn them so that they're facing upwards, and then bring them back down to your sides. You've really radically changed the posture of your upper body in doing that. It brings your shoulders back, it brings your heart open across the top. And how does that physical posture impact my relationship to the felt experience of existing? This is a posture of fearlessness, acceptance, going forth, not hiding. And you can by taking the posture, it's you get the blessings and the wind of those emotional realities, I would say. That's why we take the posture of the Buddha. When you take the posture of the Buddha is present in taking the posture of the Buddha. And that's in the Soto Zen tradition, they're very big on just sit upright and trust yourself to that. And trust yourself to just sit upright, let delusion be. It comes in the door, it comes out the door, and you're watching. And then you become such a one that it's practiced seeing things arise and seeing things fall away. Seeing notions come in, seeing notions come out. How would that give way to wisdom? When you go to the Bodhi tree in India, there's a plaque that says, on this spot, 2,500 years ago, Siddhartha Gautama sat unmoved and resolute and arose as the Buddha. Unmoved and resolute, not unmoving. His foot probably fell asleep. He had to go pee-pee. But unmoved and resolute in I can metabolize what it feels like to be a person with all of these things coming and going. And I'm rehearsing that. Because that's what's going to happen. And I'm unmoved and resolute in my curiosity and enthusiasm for the felt experience of being alive. Affection. Enthusiasm, affection. So I would suggest to find the effort that you want to make, but find the effort that doesn't make this burdensome. Find the effort that lends itself to encounter with something really marvelous. When we let ourselves experience reality in a very, very unadorned way, not adorned by my constant self-involved meaning making with it. Just to rehearse it. It doesn't have to be the beginning and end of everything that you experience from now on, but just develop that skill. Does anybody have any questions or reflections or thoughts on that? Yeah.
Just a thought that came to me while you were talking is lots of times when, we talk about Zen to people, we say there are two specific aspects to it, the meditation and relationship with the teacher. And it struck me that that's one important role of a teacher is to help you find that balance maybe between stressful striving and sitting there doing nothing. And also, maybe help you in your desire to figure yourself out and where you where you fit in that.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think a lot of people, who sit on their own meditation
Mm-hmm.
can go off in either direction in the wrong way.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
What do you think
yeah.
about that?
I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this morning. I was having this memory of my uncle. I used to steal my uncle's T-shirts because my uncle was this cool, elder punk rocker record collector, and he had a closet full of rare like band tour T-shirts. And when he was at work, I'd go through them, and I'd put them on, and I'd go to the mall to be seen. You know. So I'd have my charged GBH like T-shirt on, and I remember when I got a pyramid belt, we call them. They're like the belt with like the little pyramid shaped silver studs, and I'm like, oh man, if I wear this belt with this T-shirt, no one's gonna see the belt. And so I'm like, do I tuck in the shirt? But like I'm chubby, it's gonna look blousy. It's gonna, but I want people. And so you could say like, what's going on there? Is it narcissism? Is it trying to make a certain? I want to I don't know, win people's affections for my own gratification or something like that. Like what's really happening there? And my teacher used to say, I used to go into Dokusan with him, and he would say, I'd tell him like a feeling that I had or a desire that I had, and he would say, so that what? And he'd go, so that what? So that what? So that what? So we'd reduce that emotional fraction. And when you reduce the emotional fraction, the common denominator is always relationality, I think, is always wanting to be loved. And so I think you can have some of the greatest experiences in the world, and if it's not bouncing off of anything, it's not that fulfilling. It's not as rewarding. I have a friend that's a Theravadan monk, and he's like, don't rely on others for anything. And I'm like, where do your lunches come from? So I think, gosh, if I had to choose between awakening and friendships, I might choose the latter. And so, but I think there's certain, when you encounter people that practice wisdom traditions kind of in a vacuum, it has kind of a self-evident feeling to it, because it hasn't been tempered by the reality of relationality, and in prison, where it's like the scariest, worst place in the world, and everybody around you can be a potential threat, the way they punish you is to make you be alone. People would rather share space with someone that might kill them at any moment than to have to be alone. And what is that? Is that because, what's that phrase? All bad things in the world happen because a human is incapable of sitting in a room by themselves or something like that. But I think, but like, why? Because I think when I was training as a chaplain, Jennifer Block said to me, she was a chaplain trainer, she said, what do we do as chaplains? And people would say, like, ease people's pain, when they're like, no. We're not there to necessarily, might have the impact of easing people's pain, but you're not necessarily going in with the agenda of easing people's pain. And she said very plainly, when you witness people's suffering, it gives their suffering meaning. And I think our search for meaning is actually, I think, search for like relationality. And when our emotions are kind of bouncing off a trusted group, it's we might find that our desire to become something special is quelled a little bit. You know? Because that desire to become something special, that the common denominator of that longing is being met in community. Yeah. And
it's not necessarily even just teachers, but sangha too.
Yeah. I think it's about interaction.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think what we're doing here is a relational thing. You know. Yeah. Sorry, that was long-winded.